Hi, my name is Michelle. I work at the Reston Library. Thank you for coming to another installment of our Great Decisions virtual program. We're going to start with a brief introduction to our speaker who will give a presentation. Following the presentation, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A. During the Q&A, you can ask a question by using the raise hand feature in Zoom, which you can see if you click on participants and then click on raise hand, or and then speaking and unmuting yourself, or you can ask a question in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Carpenter, who is the moderator for our Great Decisions series.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you all participants out there in virtual world for coming around today to engage our guest speaker in what I think will be a very interesting discussion indeed. Our guest discussant today is Michael Shifter, who's president of the Inter-American Dialogue. The Inter-American Dialogue engages a network of global leaders to foster democratic government, prosperity, and social equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Together, they shape policy debate, devise solutions, and enhance cooperation within the Western Hemisphere. Professor Shifter writes and talks widely on U.S.-Latin American relations and hemispheric affairs. His recent articles have appeared in prominent publications throughout our hemisphere, and he is featured on U.S., Latin American, European, and Chinese media. In addition, he has lectured at leading universities here and abroad and has testified regularly before the U.S. Congress. Prior to joining the dialogue, Professor Shifter worked on hemispheric issues at the National Endowment for Democracy, the Ford Foundation, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Since 1993, he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Latin American Studies Association, among other board, committee, and foundation memberships. He is also a contributing editor to Current History. Professor Shifter graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude from Oberlin College and is a sociology graduate of Harvard University, where he also taught Latin American development and politics. On your behalf, I'm honored to welcome Professor Shifter to our discussion today. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike, and for that very generous and gracious introduction. And thank you, Michelle, for your work on this. And a special thanks to all of you who are participating in this session. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your interest in Latin America. As the New York Times columnist James Reston used to say, you know, the Americans are willing to do anything about Latin America except read about it. And so it's very gratifying that to see of your interest, and many of us who have been following this region, who care deeply about this region, are often frustrated by not getting the interest that other regions in the world are getting these days. So I really appreciate this opportunity and your kind invitation. Since I'm the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, I really believe in dialogue, and the part of this session I'm most looking forward to is the exchange with you and to hearing your questions and concerns and comments and having a good back and forth. I'm going to be very, very brief in sharing some opening comments. And I should preface it by saying that for people who know me and know my background, I am a specialist in Latin America, but I'm not really a specialist on Central America per se. I probably focus more attention on other countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and where I lived for many years and the like. But my professional career, which started in the early 1980s, and now again, many years later, Central America is a dominant focus. When I first started at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the early 1980s, everything was focused on Central America. It was the battleground during the Cold War, a proxy war from the United States and Latin America. And at that time, unlike today, everybody in the foreign policy establishment, the highest levels imaginable, were focused on Central America, because that's where this proxy war was playing out. And the United States was extremely involved in opposing communism and the spread of communism in the region. There was a revolution in Nicaragua in the 1980s, the Sandinista revolution, that the United States was opposed. They developed an army called the Contra Army that was based in neighboring countries like Honduras, and used as a way to wage battle against the Sandinistas. And then you had military governments like in El Salvador and Guatemala at the time that were engaged in human rights abuses, but they were fighting insurgencies. And those insurgencies were supported by Fidel Castro in Cuba and the Soviet Union. And so that's where the battle was being waged. And of course, the toll from these civil wars and these civil conflicts has been incalculable. 200,000 died in Guatemala, 75,000, 80,000 in El Salvador, really tragic situations. Happily, those civil wars are over. And there were peace processes in the early 1990s in El Salvador, 1992, Guatemala, 1996. And so the governments in all of these countries are now elected. Nicaragua, although Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua is also elected, he comes close to having a more dictatorial regime and most repressive authoritarian regime in the region. And now the region has come back into focus. It kind of receded a little bit at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, but it's come back into focus because of the deterioration in those countries, and especially what we call the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And each one is, I think, very different. One has to be careful about lumping them all together. As we know, every country is different, but they all have some degree, and perhaps different degrees, of economic distress, of inequalities, criminal violence, and very weak and fragile institutions. And they are today the main source of outmigration to the United States. And the situation is very serious. And so it is clearly very, very high on the agenda. It was very high under President Obama, who enacted quite a strict program on deportations. Some of the immigration advocates thought that his policy was a bit excessive, and they called him the deporter-in-chief. But at the same time, with his then Vice President Joe Biden, also launched a major program initiative of $750 million a year to provide assistance and cooperation to these countries in the Northern Triangle to try to address what is commonly called in the field the so-called root causes. That was a major focus of Vice President Biden, and I have no doubt we already know. There's a lot of speculation about what a Biden administration will do, but one thing we already know is what he'll do on Central America, and he'll go back to even a more robust program in helping Central America. And the idea, basically, the logic is to try to, instead of being only using instruments of sanctions and punishments and threats to try to deter migration, trying to deter migration by trying to help and assist in these countries. And that is the central idea. And I think what was called the Alliance for Prosperity, which was the program under the Obama administration, had some success, although it really was too soon to know. It really didn't have enough time to really test how successful it was. And then President Trump came in 2016, and as we all know, immigration was really a central issue. I think the main issue why he got elected in 2016 to begin with, and the border wall with Mexico was a political rallying cry, and a position of zero tolerance, and very much reduced emphasis, significantly reduced emphasis on what the Obama administration had called the root causes of the problem of migration, of trying to help stem the violence and the criminality, helping to reduce the economic problems and increase economic opportunities, and also trying to build greater accountability and the rule of law, which is a significant problem in all of these countries, and in fact, in many countries in Latin America. And so there were several, just some examples, there were several commissions that had gotten underway under the Obama administration, like one in Guatemala called CICIG, which was supported by the United Nations, which was really an anti-corruption body working closely with the national judicial system, which had considerable success for a time. And even one former president was forced to resign as a result of the investigation. And then there was another effort in Honduras called MACI, the acronym MACI, that was linked to the Organization of American States, and also had some success, not quite as much as the Guatemalan effort had, but also success. And now both of those have been dismantled. They've been dismantled because we are very close allies with the governments. The United States is close allies with the governments of these three countries. And of course, governments don't like anti-corruption bodies and investigation, especially when it gets too close to them personally, as well as people who are associated with them. And so this is an example of an advance that was made during the Obama years, and that was undone during the Trump years. And in fact, all of these countries really accommodated to a remarkable degree President Trump's pressures on them to hold back migration in their country, even by the use of force. As we know, troops were sent, Mexican troops on the border between Mexico and Guatemala, also to force them out, to force them away. And there was just, and these governments accommodated that. They also were so-called third countries, where migrants who were heading towards the United States, instead of seeking asylum and going to the United States and going through the normal process, would have to get processed within those countries. And that was a way to prevent them from getting to the United States. The United States kind of abdicated its traditional role and pressured the governments of these countries to assume that role, which they never assumed before. And of course they did, because of the United States is the superpower, and there's asymmetry between the power of the United States and these countries. And so they accommodated and acquiesced with the Trump administration in this. Now we have an interesting situation where we have a new administration coming in, and just in January 20th. And we have, I think, whether you're for or against President-elect Biden, you have to recognize that he's somebody who does have a lot of experience and knowledge about this region in particular, and Latin America in general. He made 16 trips to Latin America when he was vice president. So, and many of them to these countries. And so although they have new leadership, he knows a lot of the key actors, he knows the key issues, and the like. And he will return to a focus on trying to attack root causes. He's still convinced that this is the best way to address this problem over the long term. And he's proposed $1 billion a year, a $4 billion program over 4 years to do this. In addition to that, clearly the treatment of the migrants from this region, which has been, as you've seen, all of you have seen the images of, of family separation and children in cages. Obviously, that will take a dramatic turn and will turn to a more humane approach towards immigrants, and I think more sympathetic. But at the same time, President-elect Biden has a serious problem. And the problem is that if he has a very liberal, let's say, policy on immigration, and the word gets around easily in these countries, then there could be a significant outflow of migration, which could cause, and which our system is simply unable to deal with, that we would be completely overwhelmed, which would cause a major crisis, a migrant crisis, similar to the one that we had with the unaccompanied minors in 2013, and would become a very serious political problem for an incoming and new administration. So I think the challenge for the new administration will be to balance a more humane approach, beginning to channel resources to help improve economic opportunities, democratic governance in these countries, to make these countries more viable, so that people will be less of incentive to leave, while at the same time not encouraging a massive wave of migrants that would put enormous strain on the U.S. system and would really create serious political problems for a new administration. So that, I think, is, so I think this is the Central American, especially these three countries, it's very, very timely. There are a lot of things about the incoming Biden administration that we simply are speculation at this point, what he'll do. But this, I think we could be reasonably sure of, and he has on his website, he has a whole page devoted to this. And I have listened to him a number of times talk about these countries, and I think his concern and his commitment are very genuine. So I would expect to see that. But at the same time, he is going to have to be tough, and he will demand serious conditions of accountability to make sure that whatever money it goes there is directed to these governments and also non-governmental organizations are used for their intended purposes. And we all know that there's massive corruption in these countries. That's why these bodies were set up by the UN and the Organization of American States. And I believe that that the Biden administration will be very tough in ensuring that additional funds that are directed for these things, different areas, are used well, and that there's transparency and honesty in the use of resources. And so there will be enormous pressure for these governments that currently I think are frankly pretty problematic partners because of the problems that I've mentioned. The test will be whether they would be prepared to really make commitments and hold to and adhere to the highest standards in terms of the use of these funds and support, so to make sure that they're actually effective in achieving their purpose. That is a tricky, complicated challenge, but everything that I've seen, and I'm not confidently predicting resounding success. But I am saying, just as an analyst, that I think that this is where the Biden administration is headed. It's not going to be easy. It requires enormous engagement, not just money. Money doesn't solve problems. You need to be much more engaged in other ways as well. But I think that is a challenge. And of course, neighboring countries like especially Mexico, where a lot of Central Americans go through Mexico, is going to have to be participate in this cooperative effort as well and support it. It's not enough for the United States just to give the funds to these countries directly, but they really will have to get other countries, especially Mexico, on board, which of course is also a complicated bilateral relationship now with the President Lopez Obrador, who still has not recognized President-elect Biden. So there could be some strain there. But in order for this to work, Mexico has to be committed as well. So here we are at a difficult moment, but I think we do have a shift in the U.S. approach, and that's coming. And in my view, it's a welcome shift, and I think will help restore American credibility that I think has suffered because of the treatment of migrants from these countries. And basically, these are people that are just looking for economic opportunity. Then there's a sense of desperation. And unfortunately, some of the elite, economic elites and political elites have not been as committed to their country's development, but rather committed to their own continued prosperity and personal situation. And so a lot still has to change. And you know, there are good actors there. My organization is very involved with business leaders in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras and other places. They understand that for the long-term viability of these societies, that there has to be higher taxes, there has to be a greater commitment on the part of those with resources to commit to these countries. But that number has to expand, and it has to be more significant. And I think that there will be a lot of attention to that and pressure in the coming years. So I'm sorry I went a little over time, but I think I'll leave it there if that's okay, Mike, and happy to hear any comments or take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opening remarks, and I think it'll set the tone for our discussions. You've covered a lot of territory, and in addition to your very fine article, it gives us a lot to think about. Funny, if I may, I'll claim the privilege of posing the first question, but I was particularly struck by your reference to money in this area. And I think that the new president of El Salvador, when he was running for office, his slogan was, there's enough money when nobody steals it, which I believe shows a step in the right direction. But the other thing that struck me in preparing for today's discussion was the video that we watched. And being an old creature of our foreign service as I am, I was particularly struck by the comment of Ambassador John Negroponte, who had served in Honduras as our ambassador from 1981 to 85, and in many other posts around the world. But his statement that is, and I quote him, he says, as someone who has been associated with Central America for 35 years now, I often ask myself why they haven't made more progress. And I was, kind of dismayed to hear that statement. I took it almost as being a little bit disingenuous. What is, I think you hit the broad brush strokes as to what is holding it back, but I usually like to end the week on Friday afternoons on a high note. And I'm finding myself becoming increasingly depressed. Again, reading your article, viewing the video, hearing your remarks now, it just seems almost problems that are almost unsolvable, irreconcilable. It's so terribly complex.
Well, thank you. And my intention wasn't to depress everybody. It was simply to give the way I see the situation, the real situation. I think there's I think looking for silver linings, I do believe that this is the question of what's holding the country back. I mean, we could assess and talk about U.S. policy, which I think has been mixed at best.
At best, indeed.
At best, towards the region. I'm just finishing a book now on the MS-13, the gang in El Salvador. It talks about its history and its origins. It's a very good book by Steve Dudley, if anybody's interested in it. And basically he talks about, that the gangs in El Salvador today, learned their trade in Los Angeles, and they were exiles from the wars in there. And of course, the United States was providing aid to the government, and it was a repressive government. And so people left, and then they got training and was exposed to Los Angeles, the gangs in Los Angeles. And then they came back to El Salvador. So there are lots of connections there that perhaps people aren't aware of, but I think are important pieces of the whole story. But I mean, if I were going to attach different weights to different factors, I certainly would attach the main weights to the elite structures, to a small group of people who are very well off, and who are very, who are not farsighted enough to understand that the role that they have to play in their own country's development. And I'll never forget a conversation. This is a conversation I had with a business group in Guatemala a long time ago, in 1994. And I was in their office, and I was talking about a lot of things about Guatemala and how they saw things. And it was a very amiable exchange up until the point where I talked about them paying their fair share of taxes, and how they saw that, and didn't they see that as a problem. And it set them off, almost an emotional reaction, as if, their reaction was, why should we pay taxes if the government's so inefficient? And that was the attitude. And I said, well, government's inefficient because it has that's part of your responsibility. And both in financial terms and also as leaders of this society. And so I think that issue has been and it's still a problem. Now, is it changing? My answer is a little bit, but not fast enough and not far enough. And there are groups in some of these countries of younger business leaders, people in their 30s and their 40s, who do have a different outlook and a little bit more farsighted, and know that it's good for their own self-interest. They have to adopt more of these sort of modern, more enlightened policies of paying your fair share of taxes. And so those are areas where I think there's I think some hope. At the same time, there is corruption, but there has been an anti-corruption movement, and forced the president to resign in Guatemala. And that was a moment that I think nobody would have predicted many years ago, that would have been possible, to have people mobilize on the streets and against the corrupt leadership and have them removed from office. So that does reflect a growing consciousness and less tolerance of corruption than we've seen in the past. Some of these countries now, one issue that's very common in our discussions about the new administration is the role of China. China is also beginning to play an important role in investment in El Salvador and other places. There are a number of cooperative agreements. And so there may be new actors, and of course this is a sensitive issue for the United States. And but I think the more capital there is available for projects that could help lift people up, I think that has to be seen as a positive. So I think there are good signs. And one point we should just not forget is that I asked this journalist that I mentioned to you, Mike, Carlos Dada, a while ago, and he gave a talk at my organization on Central. He's from El Salvador. He gave a talk, and it was not, not exactly uplifting, upbeat talk, but I said, well, so is this as bad as it ever has been? And he said, no. He said, at least, during the war, there was no way that journalism could be practiced, independent journalism could be practiced. It was just impossible. And even although today we're under pressure, it's difficult and so forth, it does make a difference if you have an elected government, a democratic society, as difficult as that is. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective, and people aren't being killed because of their political beliefs. There are other reasons why there's violence, but not for ideological or political reasons.
Thank you. I defer to the people out there in virtual land. Any questions?
Well, if I may say, it seems like you've got a chicken and an egg problem here. You can't improve the condition down there until you improve the economy. You can't improve the economy until you get better democratic government. Now, if we're going to tackle this problem, maybe we should do it one step at a time. Which would be more important, improve the economy or help them improve the government? It would seem to me that you want to improve the economy first, get people jobs and, keep them employed and get them paying taxes down there. And then once that gets rolling, then you can improve the government and get more responsive democratic government.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, and I agree with that. And what you're expressing is a big topic of discussion among specialists. You can't do everything at once, and you have to start with something and then try something else. And this is a big, this is a big debate. Of course, it was a big debate about China as well. First you have to have the economy, and then the political part will come. Of course, that hasn't come with China, but obviously the economic part has significantly. But I agree with you. I think that I think the region is in a bad situation economically. And one of the things that, just logically, that would improve the economy in these countries is to have a greater degree of integration among them. If Honduras is stronger, if it works with El Salvador and Guatemala and other countries in the region, there's more people, there's a stronger economy, and I think that is something that has been a source of a lot of frustration, because there are some mistrust among these countries. And each one, in dealing with the United States, in my experience, each one wants to deal with the United States on its own. And they're not as inclined to come together and to say, hey, we have a set of problems, our economies are in bad shape, and this is what we propose, this is what we need. So I think that would be a first step, because the small economies like these are I think their position is enhanced to the extent that they could join together. So I think you're right. I think I think the policies, I think the economy is absolutely key, and I think that I think the Biden administration, incoming administration, recognizes that as well. I think that there's I'm not confident that I think they'll probably try to tackle everything at once. But I agree with you that it's hard to come up with a viable government and a stable government if you don't have people who are so desperate in economic straits that they're thinking of any way to leave the country. So there have been a lot of I can refer to a lot of professors at Harvard and elsewhere that have come up for different economic plans for the region and different ideas for the region, moving to a knowledge economy. It's based a lot on coffee and agriculture now, and so and I think small steps have been taken, but clearly a lot more needs to be done. And I think if you have a business community that's willing to, to be committed to this and to pay their taxes, that's a huge step towards creating economic opportunities in these countries.
Thank you. It looks like our next question is from the chat. So I'm just going to read it out directly. It says, can you talk for a bit about how gangs and drug cartels complicate matters? Also, we read recently in the New York Times about the 80,000 disappeared people in Mexico, which seems driven by drug gangs. Is that just an extension of the drug gang problem in the Northern Triangle?
Yes, thank you for that question. I really neglected in my opening remarks to talk about the drug issue explicitly, and that's a mistake. I think it's a significant piece of this very complicated, troubling predicament that these countries are in. And I do think that a lot of, as I mentioned in the article, I think there's a section in the article where I talk about this a little bit or write about it, that that a lot of the these countries in Central America don't produce drugs, but they're transit points, and a lot of the drugs come through them. In Honduras, if you have weak governments and fragile governments that don't control their own territories, that's very attractive and fertile terrain for cartels that are operating in Colombia, Mexico, and elsewhere to get drugs that are made in Latin America to the United States. And so that, I think, is a very big piece of it. The gangs, I think it's a mistake to call the gangs, drug trafficking organizations, which some people do. They are, they're criminals and terrible criminals, but they operate largely through extortion, and certainly are responsible for a lot of violence and killings. But I think if you ask, why is there violence, you have to look at different parts of it. But I think drug trafficking is no doubt a piece, and the situation in Mexico is awful. There are vast parts of Mexican territory, swaths of territory that are controlled by drug cartels. And the problem of disappearances, while that is in some ways was very shocking news, it was not surprising, because at least somebody who has followed it, I've heard a lot about massive disappearances in Mexico, because the drug wars are intense. And the current president of Mexico, López Obrador, I interviewed him during his campaign to be president of Mexico here in Washington. And unfortunately, I asked him, how are you going to address this, become president, which of course he is president. And unfortunately, his response, which was disappointing to me, was that, we have to reduce poverty, and we have to give people jobs and increase development and so forth, which of course everybody is for, nobody's against that. But there was not really very clear thinking about how do you target, policies on this specific problem of the drug, reducing poverty. First of all, in Mexico is going to take a long time, even if it's done well. And the country doesn't have a luxury if cartels have so much power. And second of all, it's unclear whether, even if you do reduce poverty, that's going to make a big impact or big dent on the drug trade and drug traffickers. So, when he came into office, I met with his team in Mexico City and went down there. And again, it was not, it was pretty disappointing that they really hadn't, the key people on his team hadn't really thought this through adequately. So, the drug war was started in Mexico in 2006 under Felipe Calderón. And it's continued under the Peña Nieto, which is a different party, and now López Obrador, who has brought in the military to play a much stronger role than it ever did before, but of course you have corrupt military. And we have a case of General Cienfuegos, you may have read about in the New York Times and elsewhere, general that has been prosecuted for drug trafficking here in the United States. And he was returned to Mexico for prosecution, although I think it's doubtful that he'll be prosecuted in Mexico, because the military, I think because the military in Mexico said, you know, this is too much, that we have a general minister of defense who is being tried in the United States. This was just an affront, and it was very sensitive. And so he is going back to Mexico. But this is a major problem, the human rights problem, and it really hasn't been one that has been on the agenda of the Trump administration at all. The disappearances and human rights violations and just things getting out of control. I think it will be under the incoming administration, but that may cause some tension because I think, you know, the president of Mexico doesn't want the United States telling them, you know, you got to take care, you got to have fewer disappearances, or you have to really crack down. You can't, this is, you know, outrageous, 80,000 disappearances. That's not something the Mexican president wants to hear. So that could create some unease and some strain in a very, very important relationship. George W. Bush, when he was president, said Mexico is the most important bilateral relationship the United States has in the world. And you could say maybe today, you know, China is, or others are, but certainly it's a country where we have just a broad range of interests and areas in which we work together. So I think this is what is going to be interesting to watch with after January 20th in relation to Mexico. No, but the situation is clearly very, 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 very difficult. And yes, the Mexican cartels do not only operate in the Northern Triangle countries, but if you speak to Colombians, they're very involved in some, you know, drug trafficking in Colombia as well. The Mexican cartels have grown significantly, so it's a major problem. I mean, part of Mexico, the parts of Mexico, Mexico's a wonderful country. I love Mexico, and there are parts that are absolutely fine, but there are large swaths of the country that are where there are these, you know, drug wars, battles that are going on among the cartels and the army, and it's extremely dangerous, and a lot of people are getting killed, unfortunately.
Thank you for answering that question. I do have a question from the chat, but first I just wanted to see if there was anyone in the audience. I saw some people unmuted. If you would like to ask a question, go for it. Yeah, Mr. Melberg.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question about the immigration out of the Northern Triangle through Mexico and into the United States, where, you know, when I look at the geography, it's hard for me to imagine significant numbers of immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers passing through virtually all of Mexico to get to the United States border without the facilitation of Mexico, whether that's implicitly or explicitly. So it seems to me that, you know, Mexico is the critical part of the wishbone here. And I'm not sure, you know, what it is we could do in regard to helping Mexico with this kind of a problem.
Well, thank you for that question. I think, you know, while there's a lot of criticism that I have about the Trump administration, this I think is something that he, you know, put a lot of emphasis on and put a lot of pressure on the Mexicans to crack down, not to let this happen, because that's the way they get to the, you know, and in fact, you know, it's had some results. You know, the flood of immigration has been contained as a result of that, and Mexico is playing a much, you know, a much more cooperative role in you know, in that than it had before. Of course, all of these people, you know, can find ways to, you know, one thing we've learned about immigrants, if they're desperate enough, they find a way to get to where they want to go.
Right.
And where they want to go is here. And so, but I think, if you asked anybody who was a specialist on Mexico, and I'm not, don't consider myself one of them, but if you ask them, can you imagine the Mexican government really, sending troops and to the Guatemalan border so that Guatemalans can't enter and Hondurans can't enter the country, they would have said that's impossible a couple of years ago. And that's what we see. And the Trump administration has put a lot of pressure on Mexico to do that. So I think that's, one of the things, and I think that, that Biden administration will continue that. I don't think that they will have a different style and different approach and won't be treating the migrants the same way and won't be allowing for the cages and the separated families. But I think getting Mexico as a player and supporting this is absolutely fundamental. Yeah, I mean, well, a lot of people also, as there are also a lot of people that, independent of the government, a lot of people that, who make a lot of money out of this, and there are people that take advantage, smugglers that take advantage of migrants who have few resources and say, I can help you get through this, Mexico to get you to the border. And in exchange, I want $5,000 or whatever amount of money it is. And these people, poor people, are terribly exploited, but, there are people that do that, whether they're called coyotes or smugglers or whatever, but it's also, and they know how to navigate this. That's their, and they say, I can get you there. And they offer a lot of promises and they get paid and they exploit, I think, these very, very poor people that are just trying to, to eke out a living.
Drugs certainly do seem to be a problem. In the video that we viewed, there was a Coast Guard officer who was quoted as saying that cocaine is the genesis of all the problems. And certainly I think in your article and the video itself did point it out, we might be our own worst enemy in that regard because we're the major consumer of cocaine in the world, the United States.
Right.
Which gets to an even larger issue. What should we do about our drug laws? Would there be ways to legalize these substances so it wouldn't be so attractive to the criminal elements on the face of the earth to smuggle these drugs? Is that maybe I'm going off track here, but is that the ultimate solution? Because everything we've tried in the war of drugs or the DEA for the past 30 to 40 years, it doesn't seem to come up very well.
Right. No, you're not off track at all. You're exactly on track. This morning, I got a tweet that I could share, but there's that there was a vote in the House of Representatives to support the legalization of marijuana. And we saw in our elections on November 3rd, a number of state ballots and measures. I think Oregon was perhaps the most extreme, legalizing cocaine. But I think it's clearly, I think, a problem when the United States has so many states that have legalizing, drugs, and at least marijuana. And yet there is this kind of punitive prohibition and crackdown that the United States is supporting in Latin America. I think some Latin Americans are very sensitive that they see that as contradictory, hypocritical, that somehow we're moving towards more openness in the United States, and yet we're not as accepting of that in Latin America. And so I think attacking our problem is the U.S. problem is definitely important. We have to do a lot more. It's not only the consumption of drugs, but the typical question from a Latin American colleague on this would be, well, there have to be some people, making a lot of money in the United States off of this too. There are criminal rings and criminal organizations, not just in Sinaloa or in Medellin, but perhaps also in, Chicago or wherever. And what is the U.S. doing about that? And why, the focus on these groups, which which are a problem in our countries, but less of focus on the United States itself, where there has to be, the drugs are getting there and somehow they're getting distributed and they're getting sold and so forth by some organization. And so there's a lot of, I think you hear that a lot from Latin Americans, that there seems to be a bit of hypocrisy there. I think, I'm not sure whether, I'm frankly not sure whether full legalization of all drugs is necessarily the answer. It may, it may have positive effect, but we've had some experiments with this in Latin American countries like Uruguay. I think the evidence is unclear. And certainly if you, and I think politically, I can't imagine that, at least in the short term, that the United States would go to a point of legalizing, cocaine and heroin. Marijuana, I think people make a distinction, and that's a different story. But I think you're right. There was just I'll refer to a report that just came out on a drug policy in the Western Hemisphere. Just came out this week, actually, which does call for some changes in U.S. policy, like eliminating what we call the drug certification, that the United States certifies countries whether they're cooperating with drugs. And then if we deem that they're not, then there are consequences for that. And clearly, we shouldn't be in the position of sort of judging other countries whether they're cooperating with drugs when the drug problem is a shared problem. And as you rightly say, we have a lot to do in this country, and so that is one of the recommendations that came out of that commission's report. You could find that on the website. It's called the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission, and they just issued their report this week. So it is getting some attention. I fear that sometimes the drug problem is such that people just like what you said at the beginning, Mike, about Central America, that people say there's some problems that are that are tough but are doable, and other problems that are not soluble, that we can't solve. And some people have been sort of working on this for many years, and as you say, nothing has really worked terribly well. And yet it's still very important and still creates enormous problems, and economic problems, and obviously violence and corruption and everything else. It feeds all of those issues. So it's a tough one, and I think we're making some progress here, but we have to be more sensitive, I think, of what we're doing here and how that is perceived in Latin America, and that we're not kind of lecturing to Latin Americans to not do something that we're in fact doing in the United States.
Well, it seems to be a second attempt at a noble experiment, and it's not faring much better than our first attempt back in the 1920s.
Right.
It just strikes me that it's more of a public education and more of a public health problem than anything else, because you're never going to totally squelch the demand for these things, and we have to be more creative in how we approach it, because it just wreaks so much havoc and mayhem and corruption everywhere. It's a cancer.
I agree.
Any other questions out there from our listeners?
I got another question, if I might.
I
What's the role of or the impact of income inequality over time in the region, in terms of where it's been and where it is now?
Well, I think the income inequality is these countries. Well, first of all, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. Just as a starter, and unfortunately, some of that inequality gap was reduced to some extent in the first decade of this century, the 2000s, when Latin America, at least parts of Latin America, were doing quite well and had pretty good growth, 5% or so, and those levels of poverty and inequality in a number of countries went down. We have evidence already with this pandemic, which of course has hit everybody very hard, that levels of inequality are increasing. And not only inequality in terms of income and wealth, but just inequality, in the sense of who has access to technology and who doesn't have access to technology, inequality in education levels, and the like. And that's something that has been exacerbated by the current crisis, and it's something that my organization, the Inter-American Dialogue, is really addressing with our very, very active dynamic program in education and technology, and really trying to ensure that there's not that gap doesn't get wider, and that people who are vulnerable and don't have access to technology really have that access, because especially under these current circumstances of the pandemic. But I think I think inequality is it's not, there was it's also, relative inequality. It's not simply even people whose own situations may be getting better. There's more social media, there's more information out. And so people know that other people are moving even faster. The rich are getting richer, so-called. And so even if you're getting better, your absolute situation has improved. And relative to others, to those who are at the top, you're not. The difference can be widening. And that, that's politically very toxic. That creates a lot of resentment. And that's been expressed, by people going to the streets. The biggest example of that is the case of Chile. Chile, as you know, has been one of the best performers in all of Latin America, and until October of last year was seemed quite stable, and then it exploded. And part of the reason it exploded is because even though GDP was high and it was one of the best performers in terms of growth, levels of economic inequality were getting greater. And people went to the streets, and now they're having doing a new constitution, where they're having a vote in April on a new constitution. That's where it's ended up, because there was just so much anger and frustration on the streets. And really, inequality was the driver. And again, it's inequality in a lot of different aspects. It's not just the economic aspect or your income aspect. It's also the way you're treated, the way people are treated, the sense of privilege, a sense of entitlement that people have in society. Those kind of things are real problems and are expressed politically. The good news is that, things like the pandemic and have laid them bare, have revealed them, have exposed them, and have been a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of political leaders and economic leaders. And hopefully they'll take the right measures to tackle this fundamental issue, which I think is really sort of the Achilles heel of Latin America.
Thank you. Marianne, we'll get to you in 1 second. I had a question from the chat from a while ago that I wanted to get to next. The question as written is, and you've spoken about this a little bit, but maybe you have something to add to it. Can you address the inconsistency of the U.S. approach to these countries, Obama and now Biden admin versus the Trump administration, and how that is perceived by the business community and government officials?
I'm sorry, what was that? You mentioned it again?
Can you address the inconsistency of the U.S. approach to these countries,
right,
from the different administrations, and how that is perceived by the business community and government officials?
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, if you take the last administration, the outgoing Trump administration, there's clearly, there's clearly a sense that if you're helpful to the administration on their main issue, which has been migration, then they are prepared to turn a blind eye to other things. This is what people call about the transactional approach to foreign policy. That this is a transaction. You give me what I want. You take a hard line and crack down on people who are going to migrate to my country, so I reduce the numbers. and I'll let you, get away with, I won't, call attention to problems of corruption of you and your administration or to human rights abuses and the like. And the elites in these countries, have that clear. I think that I believe that it's important for these issues to be on the agenda, but the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of people in these countries, I know them well, have not been unhappy with being able to have lots of these human rights abuses and corruption and the like without being called on it by the United States and turning a blind eye. So, and I think that if you have an administration that's coming in that really puts this back on the agenda, there will have to be some accommodation. It's not to say that corruption will be eliminated or human rights will, abuses will no longer be there, but they will be on the agenda. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, we've seen in the rollout of the foreign policy team of the incoming administration, a concern about values, which had not been the main motivating driver of the Trump administration. It was basically, we got to take care of migration, and you crack down, and so we're not going to give you a hard time on some of these other issues. So I think the elite groups, I think, have that figured out, and I think right now they're probably figuring out how far they would have to go in order to, they all want good relations. They all need good relations with the United States. They can't afford to be antagonistic or adversarial. At the same time, the way these societies run really go at the core of what they are, and they have their interests that they're going to want to protect, and the way of doing things that they're going to want to protect. And so I think that's going to be, very interesting to watch in coming time.
Thank you. And for the next question, Marianne, would you like to ask your question?
My question is about climate change. Mm-hmm. And of course, what we have seen, just this year with the number of hurricanes, and of course, where they're going and the length of this season. If you could speak to that. And of course, we know Secretary Kerry will be working with the Biden administration on that. But if you could give us some of your views. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for raising that. And of course, that is another issue, not only another issue that will be on the agenda that hasn't been under the Trump administration, but I think it's going to be much more than we saw under Obama. Some of the other issues like democracy, human rights, corruption, we saw in the Obama administration when Vice President Biden was involved in Central America. But we're at a different moment now on climate change. There's a much greater sense of urgency. It's a much higher priority, especially for certain sectors of the Democratic Party that will be in key positions, and it will no doubt be on the agenda with these governments, and I would say all of Latin America as well. And so I would, and these hurricanes, especially the last two, Iota and Eta, have devastated Honduras and Guatemala and other countries. And you have to throw that in the mix when you talk about what are the causes of migration. It's not just poverty, inequality, crime, and violence. It's also climate change. And there are some experts that say that it accounts for about 20% of all migration is because people are fleeing because of disasters, from natural disasters. So this is unquestionably going to be a main issue on the agenda, and I think that it will be at the top of any agenda dealing with Latin America as a whole, and certainly Central America as well. I would think that the governments in Central America would be much more receptive and sympathetic to working closely with John Kerry and the Biden administration on that issue than perhaps some of the other issues that really may affect them more directly. So I think, I mean, it's a great point, and I think there's no question that that's going to be important, and I think there are really opportunities for much greater cooperation on climate change. And I think, the United States sees itself as being, again, like on the drug issue, as part of the problem that has not been addressed, has been ignored or downplayed in recent years, that needs to come back on the agenda. And I think hopefully the United States will approach Central America in that spirit of not saying, you have to work on this, but that, we all have to work on this together. I'm hoping that that's going to be the message. And I think you'll find a sympathetic response among Central Americans, because it's causing tremendous damage, and it's a major driver of migration, increasingly so.
Thank you very much for answering that and for that excellent question. We have a bunch more questions rolling in for the chat, so we'll go to those before seeing if you have any follow-ups. So the first one that has come in, I'll just read, which is much of the discussion so far this afternoon has been about addressing the root causes of the migrant issue. What are your thoughts about needed changes on the demand for labor in the US side of the problem? I believe your article said 10% of the workforce in California is undocumented, for instance. What are your ideas on how to address this aspect of the migration issue?
Thank you for that question. I think, there are, President-elect Biden has made it clear that this is a priority for him to deal with. There are about 11 million undocumented workers in the migrants in the United States. You're not going to deport 11 million people, especially because a large share of them are so central to the U.S. Economy. I don't know whether any of you have seen these very good movies or videos about what our lives would be like without migrants from Latin America who would be taking these jobs. There was one that was very funny that was done in California about the Californian economy, and it makes the point very eloquently that this is that migrants contribute a lot to the United States in many different ways, and including in the economic way. Now, there are some things that President-elect Biden can do through, and he will do, and has already said he will do, through executive decisions, executive actions that he doesn't need the Congress for. One of them is to change the position of the Trump administration what are called the Dreamers, the DACA, which are about 800,000, 1 million people who came to this country with their family and are undocumented, but not of their own will. I just read that one of them from Columbia just got a Rhodes Scholarship, graduated from Columbia University and just got a Rhodes Scholarship to study it, and he's going to Oxford next year, and he's actually a dreamer. He came to the United States with his family when he was 4 years old. He's undocumented, but he got a Rhodes Scholarship, and so it's a nice. Obviously, worked, studied extremely hard, and deserved that. Now, there are some things that Biden, as president, has the authority to do. One of the things that he wants to do is find a pathway to citizenship for those 11 million that are undocumented that was referred to. And that he has called for immigration reform. And immigration reform is something that has to be approved by the US Congress. It's not something that he could sign a paper and say, all you 11 million, we'll give you a path to citizenship. It has to be part of a broader package, which includes the labor question that was raised and other issues as well. And so far as we know, the previous administration, it was tried by the Obama administration, it was tried by the Bush administration. They have not been very successful. The last comprehensive immigration reform in the United States was done under the Reagan administration in 1986. So, and President Obama wasn't able to get it done because, you know, everybody likes a little piece of this package, but nobody, but it's hard to get everybody to agree on the whole package, which often happens politically. So Biden is committed to making another attempt. He thinks the time is right to do that. And we'll see how successful he'll be. Part of the issue would be, you know, whether he'll have, looks like the Senate will remain in Republican hands. That may make it more complicated. But I think in order to legalize the status of these 11 million, 12 million undocumented would be extremely, extremely important. But the politics of that have not proven to be very easy in the past. And I think it was a source of frustration for George W. Bush, and it was a source of frustration for Barack Obama. And hopefully Joe Biden will have more success, and the conditions will be right for something like that. But it's not going to be easy, as we've seen with previous attempts.
Well, thank you. We have one more question that is here in the chat, going back to the issue of cartels. The question says, can you address the problem of drug cartels being able to buy heavy firearms, which overwhelm the Mexico police? Why is the U.S. not doing more to stop this flow of firearms?
Great question. Wonderful question. And, you know, there's a very simple answer to it. The Second Amendment, this is a very sensitive issue in the United States. I've written a number of reports. I wrote one on Central America in 2014, where one of my recommendations was that there really has to be, I forget now what the percentage of the firearms that are used in these drug battles in Mexico especially, come from the United States, but it's a very high percentage. Of course, there's an illegal arms sale industry globally, but the United States it's very easy for people to buy arms in the United States that are used in the drug wars in Mexico. And I wrote this report for the Council on Foreign Relations in 2014 called Countering Criminal Violence in Central America. And one of the recommendations was precisely on this issue for the U.S. policy. But it's very difficult. I don't have to explain to people on this call that sort of the prerogative of the use of firearms and that they shouldn't be restricted or limited restrictions is something that's very close to the United States. But again, this is a very big source of resentment, especially in Mexico, among Mexicans. And saying, you know, where are these cartels getting their arms? And a lot of them are getting them on the, you know, black market, and the United States is part of that. And there hasn't been very serious attempts to try to get a better control of this situation. So I agree that it's fundamental. I think it is a source of resentment. But I also think that I think it's very difficult, again, coming back to U.S. politics, U.S. politics on immigration, U.S. politics on the use of arms. All of these are very difficult. But I agree completely with the question. And in fact, it was something that I tried to push for and highlight in a report that I did about 6 years ago on Central America.
I was struck just this week, or last week, there was a lengthy article in the Washington Post about the arms going into Mexico in particular. Right. And the size of the arms, these 50 caliber guns that they're bringing in that are literally outgunning the Mexican police.
Right.
And the article made the point that the vast preponderance of the arms going in aren't from the United States, and they're from legitimate stores, largely in Texas, Houston, areas such as that. So exactly. We're a major arms exporter, contributing to
exactly.
Instability in the country to the south.
Exactly right. No, the percentage, I forget the percentage, but it's, as you said, it's very high. Maybe 60, 70% of the arms that they get are purchased legally in the United States.
Well, everybody should have a 50 caliber rifle, certainly. I mean,
Yeah, well, that goes without saying.
One of our God-given rights. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions out there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, great discussion. And I'm with Mike. I don't recall these seminars having a video, that we were supposed to review
Mhm.
in anticipation of asking you questions. That was so depressing. There just didn't seem to be a good solution to these things. And we discussed many of the points before, but I had another one, and that is not only income inequality within these countries, but what about the income inequality that seems to be emerging more and more among countries of the world? We had a seminar not long ago on the Philippines, and I'm sure if you go into the African countries, and maybe your experience in South America is that way too, it seems that a lot of the real brain power is being drawn, to Germany or the UK or the US, where the salaries are higher and the prospects are better in the long term, rather than trying to build some sort of a local indigenous, if you will, something like the Seven Tigers in the Pacific not that long ago. In your experience in development assistance, have you seen sort of the Rosetta Stone to get people to stay? I could give you anecdotes, and I'm sure you have too, where you're hopeful with a person and then you find them in the US somewhere, working for somebody. Is there a solution, even if it's not an easy solution, to help them really build a country and an economy that is lasting and durable? Thank you.
Thank you for that great question. And I don't think there's a solution beyond just, working to make the country, their own country, viable. I mean, it's kind of like a, chicken and egg thing. Countries have to be viable for people to want to stay there. But they're not going to be viable unless they stay there. So, and those kind of people are there. I always reflect in my years on Latin America that some countries seem to be more, Latin American countries more inclined or have a greater number of export, human capital, high-level human capital than other countries. And Argentina, for example, is a country that I followed. It always have these brilliant Argentines that I know, and they're all working outside. They all left the country because they've seen, political problems and inflation and so forth, and they just kind of say this is going nowhere, and so I have to, work elsewhere. Other countries, I think people, tend to come back a little bit more, and if there's sort of basic conditions of stability in their own country, I think they're more inclined to go back. And that's, Colombia maybe is one that we've seen, despite the violence and so forth. It's a country that, at least economically, is pretty well managed. It's had very low inflation, and so unlike some other countries. So yeah, I think it's a real problem, because I think a lot of the people, I agree with you, that I see in the United States who are Latin Americans who are doing fantastic work and contributing enormously to this country. One would like to think that they should contribute to their own country where they're desperately needed. And yet, if you don't have the conditions, whether it's economic conditions or security conditions or whatever kind of conditions, it's very hard to keep people to stay in their country. One of the, I don't want to depress you even more than you are, but one of the real depressing stories, the most tragic stories in Latin America today, as I think all of you know, is Venezuela. And I am struck by the number of people that I talk to in Argentina and Chile and Peru and elsewhere, where there have been 5 million Venezuelans who have forced to leave the country over the last 5 or 6 years. Most of them have gone to other Latin American countries. And I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to in Argentina that say all of the people that are doing, that are waiting tables or driving Ubers in Buenos Aires are all Venezuelan. And they all have law degrees and medical degrees and PhDs in physics and everything else. They said they're the most intelligent, impressive people that they've ever met. And yet that's what they're doing because Venezuela is unlivable. And, it's got, hyperinflation, it's got violence, it's got an authoritarian government, an economy that's collapsed, health system that's collapsed. I'm sure you know all the stories. And so you have this phenomena that people are literally walking, in many cases from, Venezuela to Argentina. And they get work wherever they can, but they're enormously well prepared and well qualified and well educated. And I hear this over and over and over again. I mean, it's not that all of them are. There are a lot of poor Venezuelans that leave too, and many of them going to Colombia. But in a case like Argentina or Chile or Peru, the stories that one hears about these incredibly talented, gifted, well-prepared Venezuelans that are just taking any job that they possibly can to survive. It really is, it just magnifies the tragedy of Venezuela, which we already know is tragic, but it makes it even more heartbreaking in some ways to hear these stories. And I don't know, the question is, will they go back? Will they ever go back? Even if you can imagine the most optimistic scenario in Venezuela where there's a change in government and policies begin to change, still will take a long time. And could these people go back to their country? Will they go back eventually? I don't know. A lot of them probably won't. They'll be they're so well educated and so skilled and talented, they'll probably begin to make their lives in Argentina or Chile or elsewhere. And the numbers are huge. We have 1 million Venezuelans in Peru, that 600,000, 800,000 in Argentina. In Colombia, there are 1.8 million Venezuelans. These are big numbers. And again, just thinking about that phenomenon and what's happening, I think just is, magnifies the dimensions of the tragedy of Venezuela. I'm sorry for depressing you more, but I just thought it was an example that that's what's happening. That really is very, very difficult.
We're all going to have to OD on Prozac after this get together this afternoon. I can see it coming.
I'm sorry about that.
It's quite all right. But would you say that it's going too far to say that the United States for a very long time has sort of treated Latin American countries as sort of a pat on the head stepchildren?
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, we seem to approach this area of the world through fits and starts. There are governments that raise their heads there that we don't like, we manage somehow to, turn them over. 1954 in Guatemala, 73 in Chile. I could go on to other examples.
Right.
We export guns, we import cocaine. When we are going to do something about immigration, and we almost did, I think, in 2013 with the gang of 8 senators who came together and with an agreement that couldn't make it through the House because of the Republicans at that time.
Right.
We almost came up with a very good agreement that controlled borders, also revised some of the immigration laws, so forth. And then on top of all of that, again, these fits and starts, we have the good neighbor policy with FDR. We have the Alliance for Progress in the Kennedy administration. You mentioned earlier the Alliance for Prosperity. And I think even the Trump administration recently did some strategic initiative for Latin America, something that they started.
Right.
It just seems that there's no concerted, long-term focused effort, a holistic effort, if you will, to really address these concerns that are all now coming home to roost.
Yes.
It's something hopefully the next administration can grapple with far more effectively.
Well, I think you articulated it very, very well. Latin America has been sort of an afterthought for the United States. And as you said, it's sort of the stepchild of foreign policy. And you know, there are very, very compelling reasons why that shouldn't be the case. But there also is this kind of just longstanding kind of paternalistic, patronizing sort of attitude about Latin America and the so-called backyard of the United States that I think is not conducive to very effective partnership. And I do think, I'm not predicting that's going to change, but I do think that having a president who does, you know, I have no doubt he does care. Now he's going to be focused. He's not going to be focused on Latin America. He's going to be focused on the United States and the pandemic and the economy and foreign affairs and China and Russia and elsewhere. But there is clearly, he does have a place for Latin America. Just as an anecdote, I saw Vice President Biden interviewed about 2 years ago on a show, and it wasn't a show on Latin America. Nothing to do with Latin America, but they were just kind of asking him about sort of what he cares about. And he said, I care about three things. And one was, of course, cancer and controlling cancer because of what happened to his son. I think the other one was criminal justice. And then he says the third is Central America. And it just came out of, it wasn't a talk on Central America. I mean, it had nothing to do with Central America. And I just kind of popped my head up and I said, what? And he said, my third thing I care about is Central America. And I thought that was quite, you know, that was before the pandemic, obviously. It was about 2 or 3 years ago that I saw him being interviewed. And I was said, wow, you know, how many presidents have we had who have said that one of their top 3 things they care about is Central America? So whether that will make a difference, you know, the constraints are great, but I think, you know, I don't think you can question the fact that he's, you know, he has that genuine concern. And, you know, and he's, you know, he traveled there to the region 16 times as vice president. That's quite a number of trips.
Michelle, any questions in line?
No more questions in the chat. Did anyone have any questions they would like to speak or add to the chat at this time?
Well, I'll have one more question. The Biden administration has many problems on its agenda. How much do you think they're going to focus on this area of Central America? How high on the agenda do you think it's going to be, or do you think it's just going to be pushed off for the time being?
I think it would be naive to think it would be, you know, the highest priority on the agenda. It's just not. But I also think to say that it'll be pushed off and just be back burner is also probably, you know, not quite right. I think it will have sort of second tier attention, if you want to put it that way. That's not going to be the top issue, but it will be, of course, you know, if there is a crisis, as Mike said, you know, the U.S. tends to focus on the region in fits and starts, and unfortunately, and it's very seldom when it's sustained attention and high quality attention. So with the unaccompanied minor crisis in 2013, the Obama administration focused on Central America, and President and Vice President Biden, you know, really gave that, you know, a lot of its attention. A crisis in you don't want a crisis in Central America, but if a crisis was, it becomes a higher priority, obviously, for the administration. So I don't think, as we go forward, all things being equal, it's unlikely to occupy that sort of, you know, high level, high tier priority. But I also think it would surprise me a lot if it just kind of falls off, given the president and also given the Secretary of State, assuming Tony Blinken, assuming he's confirmed. He's somebody who also I've heard talk about foreign policy, and he always mentions Latin America. It's not the first thing he's going to focus on, but he has, and he's also visited he visited the region quite a bit when he was Deputy Secretary of State. I know he went to Colombia and some other countries. So I just would be surprised if it kind of falls off completely. But I think we have to be realistic that there are other priorities of greater strategic significance for the United States globally than Central America.
Seems ironic because we're talking about an entire hemisphere here.
No, absolutely.
More attention wouldn't be devoted. Any other questions, Michelle?
No more questions in the chat. I don't see anyone with their hand raised.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, then it's left to me to thank you, Professor, for being here today and giving a first-tier presentation. We really, really appreciate the time and the attention that you've given to us.
Yes,
And,
we do.
We wish you all the very, very best. Thank you so much.
You're very kind. I appreciate it. And good luck and stay well, everybody. That's the most important thing.